Hi, this is Sheb. Welcome to the Faith Colloquium podcast. Today, my guest is Jay Richards. Jay did his PhD at Princeton Seminary. He's a professor at the Catholic University of America, a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, and is the author of Money, Greed, and God, which is coming out in a new edition this summer. And I'd also like to point out that Jay has written a book on the doctrine of divine simplicity. He's an expert on intelligent design, and most recently has been writing about economics. So I think that means that you're really smart, Jay. I think that's fair. So today we're talking about Christianity and socialism. So Jay, thanks for talking with me.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I should say, I don't know that I'm smart. I'm a shameless generalist, and I get interested in different ideas, and I'm really interested in the connections between theology and economics.
That's great. So it seems like more and more people, particularly in their 20s and 30s, are either sympathetic to or have completely embraced some kind of socialist philosophy. Mm-hmm. I find myself sympathetic to it when I hear the ideas of taking care of the poor, making sure the wealthy aren't taking advantage of others. It all sounds like noble ideals, maybe even Christian ideals. And you yourself were sympathetic to socialist philosophy once upon a time. Can you share the story there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in my case, I was in college in the late 1980s, didn't know anything about economics, got into a poli-sci course my freshman year, and one of the books was The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and I read it 5 times through. It's a little pamphlet. And it did what I think the professor was hoping it would do. It kind of made a persuasive argument. I mean, it's filled with these passionate pleas for human equality and the problems of poverty and the injustices in the world. So that by the time I was, end of the first semester of my freshman year, I really thought Christians ought to be socialists. Now, I didn't have a really developed Christian worldview. I was a Christian and I didn't understand the details well enough. And so, my thinking was essentially, God cares about the poor. He expects us to care about the poor. Socialists talk a lot about the poor, so we should be socialists. It was not a lot more sophisticated than that. Sure. And I spent a couple of years really thinking that. I thought, well, poverty's a problem. Inequality I took to be a problem. And the socialists at least they were making kind of the right arguments for the right people and for what I thought were the right reasons. What changed is that I kept studying economics. I was at the time kind of just really a classical liberal, so I thought I need to read the best arguments on both sides of an issue. And I kept doing that so that by the time I was a senior in college, I was convinced that actually socialism, whatever its branding, whatever the intentions of socialists, just does not work. Economic planning, abolition of private property, government ownership of the means of production, it does not help people. It maybe increases equality in the sense that it makes almost everyone except those in power abjectly poor, but it doesn't do what you'd want an economy to do, which is to allow people to emerge out of poverty through their own work, to allow entire cultures to abolish absolute poverty, which is what market economies in many cases did in the 20th century. And so I by my senior year, I was convinced that some free enterprise or economic freedom, capitalism, if you want to call it that, whatever, was a much better alternative. And it was in fact the best of the live alternatives for a political economy. It's not a utopia, but for doing what you want an economy to do, there's really no viable substitute than private property, economic freedom, the rule of law, and opportunities for free market exchanges. So I really sort of changed 180 degrees in that. My theological convictions didn't change at all. What changed was my understanding of economic reality.
So the book that you read was by Marx. Is Marxism different from socialism? Do those two mean the same thing? Can you just explain what's going on there?
It's a great question. And so the simplest way to put it is the most prominent and vibrant version of socialism in the 20th century was Marxist socialism. Marx has a very particular theory called dialectical materialism, in which history goes through these different economic stages. And so for Marx, capitalism was a particular stage of industrialization that he actually thought was important. But capitalism, as he defined it, would eventually destroy itself, and you'd have a socialist revolution. And then socialism was this temporary stage where the government owned everything, abolished private property. But then after a while, a so-called new socialist man would emerge, and then socialism would not be necessary. And they predicted the state would wither away, and you would end up with this stateless communist utopia. So even though the Soviet Union is called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, they saw themselves as socialist. They didn't see socialism as the end. They saw it as a kind of necessary evil to get to this communist utopia, which they thought was going to be stateless. Well, that didn't happen for various reasons. The main reason is that I think Marx's theory of history and economics was just completely wrong. And so they all got stuck in this socialist stage. And in that really strong socialist stage that you get either in Maoist China or in Stalinist Russia, it's a catastrophe. So nobody wants to officially endorse that. And there were other kind of softer forms of socialism and socialist theories. And so these days you hear a lot about democratic socialism, which is the idea that you get socialism through the ballot box, essentially, by it becoming more and more popular politically. You don't get it through violent revolution. Well, that sounds nice, but the current example that we have in 2019 of democratic socialism would be Venezuela. And so, maybe you didn't have the violent Bolshevik revolution that you had in Russia. It's still a complete and utter catastrophe. And that's because of basic economic realities that anybody should be able to learn in Econ 101 that just prevent socialism from working. And so whether you get it in a kind of more benign democratic form or in a violent and revolutionary Marxist form, socialism, I would argue, is just, it's not the solution to any problem that we should want. Let's talk about economic problems, but don't assume that socialism is going to be the solution.
So something that I think we sometimes hear is people say things like, Jesus and the early church were communists or socialists or something like this. Jesus frequently talks about giving away your possessions to the poor. I remember myself after college quoting Acts 2 as a defense of this kind of communist philosophy. So was Jesus and his disciples socialists, or is there some kind of connection between Christian values and socialism?
There's not really. I mean, now I would say that the socialist idea, in some ways, if you look at Marxism, I would say it's a secularized Christianity. Marx has a primeval paradise, a kind of original primitive communism. There's a fall in which you get slavery and things like that. And then you get a redemption and kind of an eternal life, an eschaton in this communist utopia. So it's a kind of secularized Christianity. Nevertheless, I would say there's nothing in Christianity or Christian theology per se that should lead Christians to think socialism is a good idea. The one counterexample that people often think of is the church in early Acts. You have the church in Jerusalem. We're told in Acts that the church at that moment, that people there would sold their possessions and held everything that they had in common. And that might sound like communism or socialism, but notice there's no state involved. Their centurions aren't breaking down doors and confiscating the means of production. Right? What you have is a small voluntary group of Christians in Jerusalem at a particular moment deciding to share amongst themselves. Now, mutual sharing is not communism or socialism. We share amongst our families. I have a family and we have one bank account. Well, that's not socialism. It's a different kind of communal arrangement. And notice in the case of the church in Jerusalem, we're dealing with a very specific situation in which thousands of Jews had come from around the Roman world to Jerusalem for Pentecost. Thousands of them had suddenly become new Christians. They were away from families, they were away from their jobs and their livelihood. And so in that moment, the local Christians, that is those in Jerusalem who had possessions, decided under the influence of the Holy Spirit, the best thing to do is to sell our stuff and to share among all these new Christians so that they could stay around for a while and grow in the faith. And so that's what happened. But this was never held up as a universal ideal for every church. You notice Paul doesn't commend this for any of the churches that he founds or he writes to in any of Paul's letters. For all we know, this kind of voluntary communal sharing stage in the church in Jerusalem lasted for 6 months. And then the Jews that had become Christians that traveled from around the world, they went back to their places of origin and proceeded from there. And so that's why it's never really been held up by mainstream Christianity as an ideal. There are small voluntary groups of monks and nuns and sisters and things like that that may live communal existences. That's fine. But notice they're always small and they're always voluntary. And so this is not the kind of state socialism that we're talking about when we're talking about political economy.
So I don't know if this is going to take us down a rabbit trail about how we interpret the Sermon on the Mount, but just briefly, I'd be curious to hear, Jesus talks about people who ask for your shirt, give them your coat as well,
right?
Things like this. I guess I'm curious, what do you make of these kinds of texts?
Yeah, I think that the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain, and I assume Jesus gave sermons like this many times, at least two of which we have recorded in Scripture. What's the point? So is this a sermon against clothing merchants? Is him saying you should give the coat on your back? Is he saying there shouldn't be people that are allowed to sell coats in the town square? I mean, obviously not. That is clearly not what he's saying. What he's talking about is a kind of super powerful generosity in which somebody asks something for you, and rather than thinking about your stuff, you're so generous that you will give them the shirt off your back. If somebody asks you to lend them some money, you'll lend them the money, and in your heart, you're so generous that you don't even expect them to pay you back. Now, this wasn't a statement about regular banking. It was a statement about the personal generosity that we ought to have for our fellow human beings, and especially for our fellow believers. And so that's what Jesus is talking about here. This shouldn't be taken as kind of universal laws for how to conduct clothing business or banking or something like that. And that's almost always how these texts have been understood. We're not explaining them away. We're just saying this is, focus on what he's actually saying. Don't take these as principles of political economy or something like that. In fact, when Jesus tells you you've got a coat, right? Give the man the coat on your back. He's presupposing private property. He's presupposing that you have a coat that you own, that you have the discretion to give to someone. So in many ways, he's presupposing ordinary private property and the workings of a market, even when he's giving this advice.
So it sounds like you would say like that would be like kind of co-opting Jesus into a socialist agenda, which would just be foreign to him.
It would be, yeah. And the fact that this was never, my view is that you want to interpret Scripture not as sort of Jesus and me in the Bible, or really just me in the Bible. Read these texts as Christians have always read them. And if there's a general way Christians at different times and places have read a text, give that the benefit of the doubt, and don't assume that you 2,000 years later are going to really have you're going to discern the real meaning when Christians historically had no idea what it said.
Right.
It's just simply not how, except for fringe groups, these texts have ever been understood. And so that's why almost always when you hear someone claiming to make the case for socialism in citing proof texts like this, if you look carefully, they're really conscripting the text for a socialist ideology rather than letting the text speak for itself.
Yeah, that's helpful. I remember the first time I read your book, Money, Greed, and God, and you talked about Acts 2, and you made that, just very, very basic observation that, the Roman state's not involved here. This is voluntary giving. And then as a parent now, I've got with children, when I have got my little 3-year-old taking things from her sister and then following it up by saying like, you have to share. And she's like taking things with me. It's like, we immediately say like, that's not how sharing works, right?
No, that's not sharing. If you're being forced to do it, it's not sharing.
Right. So it's a very kind of, I guess, elementary idea here.
It really is.
Yeah.
Well, and a lot of this stuff, that's what was sort of frustrating to me. In some ways, I wrote Money, Greed, and God out of frustration more than anything else, because I felt like I had to unlearn a bunch of stuff myself in college. I quit, I decided not to pursue this as a career. I was writing on science and faith issues, found myself back on Christian college campuses in the late 1990s, and realized, oh my word, the same bad economic ideas that I held before the collapse of the Soviet Union are just as popular now as they were 10 years previous to that. And now they're even more popular. As you said, at the start, I saw a poll just yesterday, actually, that 18 to 25-year-olds, a majority of them think that socialism is a good idea. Now, none of these polls ever define socialism first and then ask the question. And so what I really think is happening is that people, they just hear the word and they picture some nice image in their heads. The word has the word social in it. That sounds good. We want to be social. And so they don't actually know what it means. Whereas if you sort of gave them Merriam-Webster's definition and then asked them the questions, I think these polls would turn out differently. Nevertheless, the fact that the term socialism still has such good branding is worrisome to me.
Yeah. So again, for Christians, I think one of the things that you sometimes hear about capitalism is that capitalism is based off humans being essentially greedy. So in your book, you kind of have these different myths that you talk about. And one of these is that capitalism is based on greed. It's a system based off greed. You don't think that's quite right?
No, not at all. I mean, I know that that's the stereotype, and it's just stereotyped not only by hostile critics, but also sometimes by champions of capitalism. I mean, you get the writer Ayn Rand, who wrote a book called The Virtue of Selfishness. She was probably the leading defender of so-called capitalism in the 20th century. And yet she argued that selfishness was a virtue and that the system was built on selfishness. Well, that would be a serious problem for Christians if that were true, but it's not true. Now, of course, selfishness and greed are real things and they're real problems, but they're also universals. They exist in every time and place, in every economic system. They're not unique to market economies. We have this problem in the word capitalism. It was actually a word that Marx himself popularized, and I use it in the book, but I go back and forth about whether we should just get rid of the word or not. In any case, when I'm talking about it, I mean a market economy with robust private property rights, the rule of law, and a wide social space for individuals and companies and groups to be able to engage in mutually beneficial exchange. That's what I mean by the system. Well, there's nothing about that that has anything to do with greed, even though people might do things that are greedy. And in fact, as Adam Smith argued, in a market economy like that, this isn't the law of the jungle where people can do what they want. There's a rule of law, so you can't steal, you're not allowed to kill each other. And so that means in a system like that, a butcher, if he wants to succeed, if he wants to make money to pay his bills, he's got to provide something for customers that they'll freely buy at a price that they're willing to pay and to try to do it better than his competitors. In other words, in a market economy, a commercial business person has to try to serve other people. And so in that sense, whatever their private motivations, they have to act altruistically. That is, they have to act in an other-directed way. And so that's what I think is fascinating, is that if you look at what successful entrepreneurs actually do overwhelmingly in market economies, they anticipate the wants and the needs of others, and then they try to find ways to meet those needs. That's not greed. And so greed, whatever its explanatory power, doesn't really tell us anything unique about the capitalist or free enterprise system. It's just a problem that any culture and any economic system is going to have to deal with.
Yeah, so I think I've heard you talk about this before. You said it's like you can't become a billionaire by saying like I'm only going to look out for my own interests, right? Like you have to think about what do people need, what do people want, things like this.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's enterprise. I mean, the word entrepreneur is a French word that means it's sort of the person that bears risk. And so a really good entrepreneur is willing to take money that he's made or that he's managed to borrow, put it at risk in pursuit of a vision that he hopes will pay off in the end, but that hasn't paid off in the beginning. So they have to actually delay gratification and take risk. But, the late Steve Jobs, for all of his personal failings, he did not get rich stealing iPhones from homeless people. He participated in an act of creativity and risk in which he created value for himself and for millions of other people. That's, in a market economy, the normal way that entrepreneurs succeed.
So something that I'm currently thinking through is a question that I've got from Aristotle. Aristotle thinks that human beings aim at a flourishing, happy life, and that this life consists of having inner virtues, right?
Yes.
But it also consists of having some external goods, like some amount of money.
Right.
But he also says that for some, due to luck or misfortune, they won't be born into the right families, or they won't be born at the right time in history, so that they won't be able to properly develop these virtues or exercise these virtues. And so there are some things that are simply out of our control that we kind of find ourselves in.
Right.
So I guess my question would be this: shouldn't we make sure to sustain some wealth for people so that they could develop virtues?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And my view is essentially Aristotelian. I think that's right. I think a fully flourishing life, we're not just disembodied souls, we're bodily creatures.
Yeah.
And so to really have a flourishing life, that's going to include, the bottom layers of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We need to be able to eat and be healthy and things like that. And so I think that's really the right political economy question, Sheb, is to say, okay, what set of institutions, laws, and conditions best allow as many people as can to flourish in that way? And what we want to flourish in that way is for people to be able to enjoy what's called earned success. So in other words, it's not something that you give them, but it's that you have the conditions so that they're allowed and able to do that. And I think that's the most that we can really hope for. We can't expect, we can't have an equality of opportunity. Some people are going to be born without fathers. Some people are going to be born, with all the privileges that life can afford them. But what we want is to be able to say, okay, look, are the sort of people at the bottom, is it still possible for them to be able to have the conditions that if they at least work hard and do the right things, they can bring themselves out of a desperate situation? And so I would say, whatever the combination is, we want to set up the social conditions that allow that. Now, I don't think that means we have to give the federal government responsibility and control over all those things. I think all things being equal, you want the smallest institution to help. So if you have a family that breaks down and a child doesn't have a mother or father, I think that it should be small local communities, a local church and neighborhood and extended family that should have primary responsibility. And then you work your way out to the city and to the state. And then finally you get to the federal government level. I think the problem we've had in the 20th century is that we think that a federal government solution is the right solution to every local problem. And so I think that breaks down the kind of intricate webs of responsibility that we ought to have. And so I would like to see responsibility sort of devolve back to more local control. But I'm not a sort of anarcho-libertarian that thinks, oh, look, we're just all a bunch of isolated individuals. No, I think individuals have rights. I actually also think that we have duties and obligations to our fellow human beings, and we should have a robust debate about the best way to fulfill those obligations politically and economically and socially.
So it sounds like this is maybe where the New Testament piece would come in, that the New Testament does call us as Christians to be generous for people who encounter misfortune or their house burned down or something like this.
That's exactly it. I mean, yeah, because I think that's the danger with a kind of secular view of these things, is that people will demand their rights, but they don't also, if you have a right, that means people have a duty to treat you in a particular way. And if they have rights, that means that you have a duty to treat them in a particular way. And I think we do have a general obligation to our fellow human beings. Now, it works its way out. You have more responsibility and obligation to your next door neighbor than you do to somebody across the world that you've never met, just because you know something about them and can do something about it. But we need to think about our genuine duties, because maybe you think, well, the federal government's made a mess of the war on poverty, which I would agree with. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing something to help our fellow Americans, fellow human beings in need. Yes, we need to do that. I would just argue that you need to understand economic reality really well, so that you don't just sort of mean well, but you actually do well. In other words, you don't want just a heart for the poor. You want a mind for the poor, so that your policies and your actions are actually likely to help them rather than hurt them or create a cycle of dependency.
Maybe the last thing I'll ask you is, I'm just curious to hear you maybe diagnose, why is it that socialism has become so popular? I mean, it apparently has failed a handful of times when it's tried to be implemented, and yet people in their 20s and 30s in North America seem very attracted to it. And I'm just curious to hear why you think that may be the case.
I think part of it is that, well, honestly, I mean, people, academics that were teaching socialism, they didn't go away when the Soviet Union collapsed. They kind of went underground for a while. But look, I'm on a lot of college, Christian and public college and university campuses, and these ideas are still very much in the water. So what happened is that time went on, and college students, eventually were of the age that they didn't even have a memory of the Cold War. And so these 20-somethings that are being asked about socialism, they have no memory of the Cold War. They don't know what happened in Yugoslavia or in Poland or in East Germany. And so the word socialism and its kind of just its pleasing character, I think, ends up coming to the fore. And then if we're told that every bad economic event is caused by capitalism, or it's caused by the evils of the American economy, then you're going to think, well, what is the alternative? And so I think that's why we're dealing with this. I mean, I've been talking about this since the book Money, Greed, and God first came out, and even before that. And yet, if anything, it's frustrating to me, but it's more timely now than it was when it came out. In fact, I'm debating a prominent socialist here in about a month at Notre Dame on, should we give socialism a try? And so I finally realized, actually, these arguments against socialism and for economic freedom, you can't just make them once. You have to make them anew to every generation, because I think there's something perennially tempting about socialism. If you care about your fellow human beings and you hear this idea and it sounds like it's going to resonate with that, then I think if you don't know any economics, you're going to gravitate toward it. And so I really think it's exactly the same thing that was happening in the 1980s. It's just that in the early 90s, we had the advantage of seeing the effects of socialism concretely and in real time. Whereas now, unfortunately, we have to give everybody a history and an economics lesson before they get it. And as anybody knows, it's hard to teach people economics and history, especially if they don't want to know about it.
Sure. I wonder if there's also some element of so we've seen people try to co-opt Jesus for socialism, and if also young college students are put off by Christians trying to co-opt Jesus for capitalism as well. Jesus was a Western American capitalist.
That's right. Yeah.
And so there's a kind of a visceral kind of reaction to that. And so there's a swing to the other side.
I think that's right. And I see this among both some very conservative Protestants and some conservative Catholics that they will sort of push too far the other way. Maybe they got a slightly simplified picture when they were in high school or something.
Yeah.
But then they leap in the complete other direction. I would just argue, look, I wouldn't argue, no, the Bible teaches capitalism. I mean, it's nothing nearly that simple.
Right.
The question is, given what we know of Scripture, given what we know of economics and history, what's the best set of institutions and laws for actually helping as many people as possible truly live a flourishing life? We can't guarantee that for everyone, but we would at least want the social preconditions to be there for people that want to avail themselves of them.
When you're on these campuses and you are talking to Christian college students, is it positive reception that you're getting? Is there skepticism still? How's that been going?
I would say it's a mix.
Okay.
I mean, in many ways, I wrote Many Greeting God as the sort of necessary minimum that I thought, okay, this is what you need to know and the myths you need to recognize in order to think clearly about these things. And I have a lot of data that students that read the book, even if they're hostile at the beginning, will find it persuasive by the end. My challenge is always that usually I have maybe 1 hour to explain these things. And so it's hard to overcome a lot of people's encrusted intuitions and prejudices in an hour. So I usually just try to pique their interest and say, look, at least study this more carefully, because I think if you do, you might end up in a different place.
Yeah, that's good. Jay, was there anything else that you wanted to share about socialism and Christianity we haven't touched on?
No, I think it's a great overview. I encourage listeners. I mean, certainly check out the book if they're interested in following up. But I think this is a really burning and important issue. I'd encourage Christians not to think, well, this is some kind of secondary political issue. No, this is actually really important, and millions of people's lives and well-being actually hinge on these questions. So I think that if you're going to be a robust, fully informed Christian with a well-developed worldview, you've got to come to some clear understanding of these things.
That's great. So the book is called Money, Greed, and God, and it's coming out in a new edition this June. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Okay, great. Jay, thanks for talking with me.
You bet.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe and please share with your friends.